So, welcome to Elected, a podcast for women in Canadian politics and our active accomplices. Today, I'm joined in Madam Premier in Calgary with a very special guest, the Minister Pascale St-Onge, the Minister of Canadian Heritage. And thank you so much for coming here and agreeing to sit down and chat.
It's my pleasure. And I'm so happy to be here in your shop and have bought a few of your amazing pieces with great slogans on them.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'm not sure how much you were aware of the store before, or what I consider to be my mandate before we get into yours. But I mean, there's crossover in the conversation today around advocating for women and our political participation. And, times are increasingly more challenging for women in politics, men too, to a different degree. But, one of the things that really feeds into this is what ties into your work is the media and Bill C-18 specifically. So what's the current status of where this is and how it's impacting Canadians?
Well, we haven't seen the full impact yet of Bill C-18 because it's in the implementation phase. So the CRTC, which is the independent regulator, is responsible for the implementation of the legislation. So we're kind of in the middle of this. So the latest news is that, of course, we negotiated an agreement with Google, who had problems with the legislation and wanted to do the same thing as Meta did, which is ban Canadian news content on their search engine. But we had some very important discussions, and we came to an agreement that they would be transferring $100 million per year, adjusted to inflation each year, to the media news ecosystem. And basically, any news organization that fits the criteria of the legislation can raise their hand and be part of that agreement. And right now, I think Google has designated a collective that will represent all media across Canada in those negotiations. And basically, the last step will be for them to go to the CRTC to receive an exemption, meaning that they won't have to go through the arbitration process because they have reached agreements with the media sector. As for Meta, that's the more difficult part. The CRTC will have to decide if the legislation applies to them or not. In my opinion, and like I said, the CRTC is independent, so they will rule on that. But in my opinion, the fact that Meta has decided to ban Canadian news on their platform shows that they are actually responsible for the content on their platform and that they are editing what Canadians have access to. So being an editor, in my opinion, comes with many responsibilities. And also, we know that Canadians still find ways to share news on Facebook. So anyways, we'll see how the CRTC decides. But if they do decide and rule that the legislation applies to Meta, they could be fined with pretty high fines for having refused to negotiate in good faith with the news sector. And they will have to go through an arbitration process at the same also.
What's the timeline for that?
Well, hopefully within 6 months.
Okay.
Or max a year. I sent out the last policy directives to the CRTC. I think it was in December, last December. So before the end of the year, I hope that we have a decision, but that's going to depend on their process.
Right. And would the potential fine, if they were issued one, would it compare to what they would be paying if they were to compensate Canadian media organizations?
I don't remember the exact details, but it's pretty high.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because in some ways, I think about, some people are actually comfortable getting tickets for some strange reason because they consider it to be, it might be less than the overall.
Yeah.
Right. Rather than actually change their behavior, they'd rather just
pay the fine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And kind of martyr themselves.
Yeah. But we plan for this in the legislation. Okay. So the fines are actually pretty expensive for the platforms. And yeah, so there's lots coming.
That's good to hear because, I mean, it's definitely a challenge and one that we're all impacted, right?
Yeah.
By it doesn't discriminate and no one still has access.
Yeah.
I'll share actually. So, as someone who loves the media and the news, and used to share a lot of news, on Meta, on Instagram, for people because, as someone who maybe overconsumes, to share with those maybe who underconsume, right? And so it was disappointing when I couldn't do that any longer. So my workaround has actually been to create a WhatsApp group for Madam Premier. So it's engaged predominantly women across the country and even some abroad. And we share news articles there and discuss them.
Yeah.
But that was something that it wasn't that I had ever thought about it. It was how can we manage in this situation, in this current climate? But I know that, for example, in rural and remote communities last year during the fires, that was something that I'm sure you heard a lot about. Yeah.
And I think there's a few lessons that we can pick on after everything that happened with Meta. First of all, it's and I know that a lot of independent news outlets have been impacted by Meta's decision, and it's really unfortunate. And at the same time, I think that Meta is showing us that they are not a good business partner, and because what they are fighting against is actually being liable for the impact that their platform has on our social fabric and on our democracies and on who we are as a community. They try to not take responsibility for that. And the C-18, the Online News Act, is simply about making sure that we have a sustainable news ecosystem in Canada, which is essential to democracy. So it's not much to ask, when you compare to the impact of their platform.
And the profits that they make.
Yeah, exactly. The profits and also the social disruption. I mean, there's a lot of positive aspect to Facebook and Meta and all these social platforms, but like any products, for example, if you sell toys for kids, it comes with liability on the people that produce those toys to make sure that
it has a warning on the box.
It's age appropriate. It's
a choking hazard.
Exactly. So because any product that's being put out there comes with regulations and responsibilities, but they have had a free pass for a long time when it comes to liability about their products. And we see the impacts on children. Everything is programmed on their platform to make kids and teenagers become dependent on their tool, and retaining the public's attention. And all of it does have impacts, health impacts, security impacts. So this is a step in the right direction, making them at least accountable or responsible for, paying for the damage that it's causing to the news industry.
Yeah. I mean, it's also, I would be remiss if I didn't. There's a couple of things specific to Meta. I mean, we've all become default content creators as small business owners. Right. We all have to wear so many hats nowadays. And so, and these platforms rely on the people on them to create the content, right? So in some ways, we're all, if I got a check in the mail, I wouldn't be disappointed, right? Because I'm also contributing to their success, just like everyone is, right? Who puts any time and attention into creating content. But then also, I'm not sure if you're aware, hopefully you are, about the default political content limit that Meta has put in place. And it was done with no advance warning. There was no education component around it, and it applies to absolutely everyone. And the setting was immediately turned on to limit political content. And you have to go through multiple steps in your settings to turn it off to see political content once again. And I see this purely as a risk management issue in advance of the American presidential elections happening this fall, and the political and social consequences that will come along with that. But at the same time, people should have the ability to opt into that or opt out, right?
Mm-hmm.
We don't want to see like an opt in clause in terms like, when we send our kids to school or just, in society and in general. And, in the vein of wanting people to be more engaged, right, with real news, not misinformation.
Yeah.
Because that doesn't always get captured in that same lens.
Yeah.
And as someone who gets treated like a political party actually by Meta.
Oh,
yes. And, they've said that it can just be, anything related to a social issue, but they don't define adequately what a social issue is, right? So if Jane on the street and to make a video about, how kids in school should have access to a school food program, would that be considered advocating for a school, like a social issue? Would she fall under that?
Yeah.
I know that I do, but would she? Like, it's just all very vague and murky.
Yeah.
And the lack of transparency is not in our national interest.
I know. And that's a very important theme, transparency. And, I think one of the difficulties that governments have come across when it comes to the internet and the digital platforms is the fact that we're very slow to understand, first of all, the impacts, and then to adopt proper legislation and regulation so that it doesn't only fall on the goodwill of those platforms to mitigate or to try to prevent some of the harm that could happen on their platform, but that it's a standard. And we're in a system also, or in a situation where, relationships between countries when it comes to trade agreements or commerce, it came through, traditional trade agreements where we try to lift barriers to open markets. But this is the kind of the opposite, because they're global companies that want to be present in every jurisdiction, and every jurisdiction is asking themselves the same questions that we are here: how to best regulate these platforms so that it meets, like, their commercial interest meets at some point the public interest.
Well, they've made themselves a part of the social fabric of our communities and our lives in every single way.
Yeah.
And I think, that right, or that's maybe a different, maybe not the best word to use, but that access that they have to us comes with that responsibilities, right?
That they have denied forever.
Exactly. So, in that way, like, I would say, I think that, but the misinformation around Bill C-18,
I know,
is significant.
I know.
And you're not trying to ban or block news.
Well, I find it very, when people say that the Online News Act or the Broadcasting Act, the Online Streaming Act is about censoring the population, I'm asking them, where do you see that censorship? Because from what I see on social media, nobody is being censored.
Yeah.
You can say pretty much anything you want on this. But the only thing that's getting censored is actually news.
Yeah.
So, like, I don't understand where that comes from, because this is really about commercial rules. It's about a free market for our media industry. And, digital companies have been extremely good at monetizing their platform and making money off of their platform, but they have left no room for monetization of creators' content, of news content, and everybody who's losing in that is, like you said, the people that do create that content and that don't get paid appropriately. So this is just about creating a fairer market and more balance in the ecosystem, so that we have a sustainable news sector, which is, like I said, essential to democracy.
Well, all of these private social media companies will say that they're acting, in different ways, but ultimately, and fair enough, they're capitalist companies creating the, maximizing profits. No one, I don't, so, for the most part, we're all like, pro economy. And, you make that money. But it's a conversation with their shareholders. Like, your dividend might be slightly less.
Yeah.
And we're building this into, our system, and we just have to adapt. It's that lack of willingness to potentially, reduce their profits by like 0.32 whatever percent, right? It's all really silly.
And it's also because dividends and shareholders and the economy in general is not disconnected to a country that's well functioning. The more like Canada is maybe not there yet, but we're a fairer country when it comes to the distribution of wealth. But the more people that actually can purchase things and
it's better.
It's better for shareholders. It's better for dividends. So it's a short-term view to think that making sure that we have a strong social fabric, making sure that we have a strong democracy, that we have an informed population that can make enlightened choices. That's actually in the midterm and long term, it's better for the economy, and it's better for shareholders, and it's better for companies. So I've always believed that market is as strong and good as democracy is, and as people are capable of making informed choices. So, but we're stuck in that spiral, if I can put it that way. But I think things are evolving, and even though we're not seeing the full impact yet of the Online News Act and of the Online Streaming Act, in the next few months and years, we will. And I hope that it's going to help build the conversation around the importance of governments being present in that sphere and making sure that the public interest is well defended. Because AI, and that's the difference, I think, with social media and the internet and its evolution. We were slow to react because the risks weren't necessarily obvious right from the get-go. But I think that with AI, the risks are quite clear. So the next steps for me in that discussion is to broaden it to international partners and like-minded countries, because I think we need to align, like, all of our legislations and countries are different when it comes on the approach that we need to take. But I think that we need to
the principles
might
be similar, if not the same.
Exactly. And you talked about transparency, but that's essential. People need to know what is AI created content. People need to know also if their own content was used to create new AI content. Copyright issues is really important. Privacy, security, and intellectual property. So if we can align behind principles like that, it's going to be easier then for country to legislate and for tech companies to adapt. Because I think that they do want guidelines in that sphere.
Well, I think that there's strength in numbers, right? And so you become a more significant force when, if you were to sit down at the table and, there would be multiple countries present saying, okay, this is, we're asking you to do this. We will also take different approaches as to implementation, but you need to understand that we're on the same page in terms of, the foundational principles of what we're asking for in terms of protecting and strengthening our democracy and our societies.
And also on the cultural aspect, I think like Canada is one of the founding countries that have signed up to the UNESCO 2005 declaration around cultural diversity and linguistic diversity. And it still applies in the online world. So we need to make sure that even though we're using AI and those tools can be super helpful in different areas, and yes, with creators as well, we need to make sure that it doesn't create a uniform or a homogeneous cultural space in the digital world. And for Canada, I think it's especially important because of the work that we're doing around reconciliation, around First Nation languages revitalization and cultural revitalization, and of course, French language.
Yes, of course.
So these are things that we need to make sure that we protect and that we value. And there's 154 countries around the world that have signed that declaration around the importance of cultural diversity. So I think we can align ourselves around those principles. And then it's going to take some legislation and regulation to make sure that the rules are clear for all tech companies that
Right.
operate in the AI world.
Yeah. No, I think that's welcome. Well, and also specifically making it about politics. Not that all of it is politics, but the use of AI in political campaigns.
Yes.
The use of deep fakes, like robocalls.
Yeah.
People can honestly be fooled into thinking that they're hearing from the leader of a political party, for example, and it's not actually them. It's fake it's an AI generated voice that they're hearing. What kind of accountability is there for that? So on your end of things, on the federal government side, what's happening to make sure that that there are safeguards in place?
Well, it's a work in progress. My colleague, François-Philippe Champagne, who's Minister for Innovation, has presented a bill around AI. I think it's Bill C-67, if I'm not mistaken, the number of the bill. 27, C-27, I'm sorry. And it's the first guidelines around the use of AI, but it's not adopted yet. There's still work to do in committee. We still have a year and a few months to get ready for the next election, but there's still work to do around work for also the committee that supervises the election process and make sure that there's it's a hot topic right now, interference in our election. And so these will be new items that need to be put in those guidelines and in that supervision.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because it's not necessarily even just, coming from an opposition political figure or party. It could be foreign interference.
Yeah.
And you would never know.
Exactly. Well, we do know that there's a lot of, in the digital space, a lot of intervention from other countries to try to rise up opposition for certain social causes, like to LGBTQI plus community. It's like it increased a lot after Russia invaded Ukraine. So there are things like that we're aware of. But it's coming election, it's always more preoccupying, and we're going to see also how it goes in the United States. But it's challenging times, and there's no easy solution, and that's the thing. It's one thing to come up with slogans and perceived easy solutions, and I'm going to fix it all, but these are not things
you have to ask, how are you going to fix it?
Yeah, exactly.
You have to explain that.
Exactly. And quite frankly, not doing anything about tech giants and opposing everything that we're trying to do around regulating tech giants is not a very responsible approach.
Well, and I think, unfortunately, too much of what happens in our society, and I mean, something that really changed for me, for example, was when I had my first child, for example.
Yeah.
And then I had this baby, and then I had this ginormous stroller that I suddenly had to maneuver everywhere, and a lot of stuff. And it's really heavy and cumbersome, and it's hard to lift. They weigh a lot, or they can. And then the baby's in it, and, your most precious little person. And all of a sudden you're like, oh, I want to go into this coffee shop, right? And then there's a step and a door. And you're by yourself, and the door doesn't have, a wheelchair button, and you can't lift the baby in the stroller up the steps. And and then all of a sudden you're like, wow, if it's hard for me to get into this place with a stroller, how would someone in a wheelchair be able to get in here? And like, wow, the world of accessibility issues just kind of opened up to someone in a new way. Right.
Yeah.
But it's unfortunate that I and anyone else, we don't already have that lens around how the world is a difficult place to navigate. Yeah. Right. But too many times it's things like that you don't understand an issue until
you're hit.
Exactly. Yeah. So, it would be extremely unfortunate for people who aren't on side with this, to be touched by it themselves in a really, in a much worse way than having to lift a stroller up, into a deep fake situation, or, being targeted some way online, right? Yeah. We shouldn't want that. We should be able to
absolutely not. But unfortunately, that's the thing. rules should apply to everyone. And this is a major difference between Canada and other countries. Like for the Online News Act, specifically, Australia had
and that was the model for Canada.
That was a model. It's quite different here because it's much more transparent than it is in Australia.
Well, and the language, like the cultural components would be very different too, right?
Exactly. Yeah. But in Australia or in Europe, most parties, there's not really, there's a consensus amongst politicians and different parties that they do have a role to play in the online space. And this is something that one party here in Canada fundamentally disagrees with and campaigns on the back of it. So this is very particular to Canada, and it's not really helpful in finding the right approach and the right way to do it because it gets very quickly politicized.
Yeah.
And it becomes very partisan, when the party raises funds for their next election campaign on the back of work that we're doing in the digital space. I mean, it's not really helpful for a country like Canada to be able to live up to those challenges. And it is going to impact everything. It is going to impact our democracy. It is going to impact our economy. And if all other legislation advance in this space and we don't, it's going to set Canada behind in a very dramatic way.
Yeah.
So anyways, it's there's lots of work to do in that space, and at the same time, it would be much easier if we could at least agree that there is a role for government in the digital space.
Well, I think continue to share that message, and then hopefully have more conversations. But yeah, it's challenging times, big file. You have a huge portfolio with a lot of like really critical issues.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm really thrilled that you joined me here today and that we got a chance to talk about some of these things. And, a lot of us will continue to watch your portfolio and wish you all the best in your negotiations.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me. I've been wanting to meet you for a while and coming here. It's actually my first time in Alberta.
Oh, well, welcome.
And so this is an amazing province, actually.
Yeah.
It's really beautiful. I've enjoyed it very much so. And I'm so glad that we got to meet.
Yeah. Well, thank you.